What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then what's up? My name is Erica. Heya, how you doing? For today's video, I will be chatting to Cambridge professor Carrie VOUT about her wonderful book called Exposed: The Ancient Greek and Roman Body. Now, normally I would have shown you guys the book. However, I am currently in Florida when I'm recording this and unfortunately do not have the book on me. But I do have it back home, so I will include a photo so that you guys know what it looks like and the book that we will be diving into. I'm incredibly excited to get into this chat with Professor VOUT for, a plethora of reasons. I have so many questions about this book because this is not the topic that I know really anything about whatsoever. So I'm really excited to dive into not only statues, visual aids, but also just, I think, the ancient attitude, really, when it comes to the body, not only females, but male bodies. I presume we're going to end up focusing on female bodies because that is really where most of my questions lie. But anyways, very excited and very thankful that you're sitting with me today. So first and foremost, Professor VOUT, the way I like to start all of these interviews is actually by asking my guests about their classics background. Now, you're a Cambridge professor, you are an incredibly widely published author, you do so much outreach work, you are such an accomplished classics person. And so I was wondering where that started. Where did that love of the subject begin? And how did it end with you becoming this professor and this academic that you are today?
So it was kind of accidental, I suppose, in some ways. So I was born in Durham, and I'm the daughter of a builder. And so when I was a kid, I spent quite a lot of time on site with my dad. Not that they were Roman sites, obviously, but he did actually in later life specialize a bit in restoring some medieval buildings. And when I was doing history GCSE at school, he helped me a lot with a project I was doing on a medieval priory just outside of Durham on the River Wear. And I think it was kind of that, and visiting, National Trust properties, English heritage properties, that kind of got me interested in things and material culture. I was also lucky enough to do Latin at school, but that really was my sum total of classics knowledge, if you can call learning Latin in the way that I learned it a knowledge of antiquity in any sense. And it was really because of that that I came to Cambridge to read classics, thinking that I was really linguistic, and actually I'm not at all. And I was taught by Mary Beard was my director of studies. She looked after my program. And it was really being taught by her that I realized that I am a cultural historian, and then increasingly an art historian. And then, just kind of rolled from one thing to the next as I realized that I couldn't really let classics go. So that's sort of how it was.
Well, we're here to discuss your book, Exposed: The Greek and Roman Body. And something you wrote in the introduction was actually a quote that also inspired you to pursue higher education. So I was hoping to read this quote. I can't remember who it's by. I think it's John Berger, but I didn't actually write this down.
Oh yeah, John Berger's Ways of Seeing.
Yeah, so he wrote, "Men act and women appear. Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. And this determines not only most relationships between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves. The surveyor of women in herself is male, the surveyed female, and thus she turns herself into an object." So I was wondering what it was about this quote that really, elicited a reaction from you to then continue learning.
Yeah, so I didn't put that in the introduction. I put that, I think, in the sort of introductory sections of one of the later chapters, which was talking about gender and sexuality and and being a woman in antiquity. The reason that book, I think, was so instrumental in my development was actually it was on my pre-university reading list that my college, Newnham College, sent out to us all. They sent us a selection of weird and wacky things, very few of which were actually directly related to classics. And I remember going to the bookshop in Edinburgh with my parents and handing it over to somebody and saying, "Do you have any books on this list?" And they said to me, what the hell is this? This is the weirdest book list we've ever seen in our lives. And the only book on it they had was John Verge's Ways of Seeing. And so I bought this little book. It accompanied a television program that had been very, very popular just before I was born. And I'd never heard of it. I'd obviously never seen the program. But it's a book. I mean, do you know the book, Erica?
No, I don't.
So it's brilliant. It's this little book which has, small chapters on the visual, but also then chapters which are just pictures. And you are then left as a reader to construct your own essay, in a sense, based on how you think the pictures fit together and work together. And I don't know, that quote just had a lot of resonance with me as a kind of, 17-year-old girl who'd never really thought about what it was to be a girl in a world surrounded by images of women that, inculcated me to look a particular kind of way and to be sort of seen in a particular kind of way. And it's just been very influential on me in thinking about bodies as they're depicted in the kinds of visual culture that I now study back in Greece and Rome and the receptions of those through time.
That's really interesting. I've never heard of that, so I'll definitely look into it after this.
It's great. I mean, it's a book that's still talked about a lot and obviously commented on, because we now no longer live in a world in which we think about gender in a binary way. So it's had a lot of criticism too, but I think it remains something that's good to think with.
Now, the journey from you being a professor to then writing this book, as well as something you touched on in the introductory chapters of this book, was also describing a bike accident, if I'm not mistaken, that you had, and then also accompanying that, but also not really accompanying that, just accompanying this in the reason for writing the book, was then a lecture you gave on Ovid specifically. So I was wondering if you could explain those two things and how they ended up becoming the book.
Yeah, so I was invited to the Wellcome collection in London to a book launch of a book by the Dr. Gavin Francis, which is called Shapeshifters. And it's a book about bodily change, really, based in a sense loosely on case notes that he has taken. And it deals with everything from aging and the menopause through to sex change. And he had contacted me prior to its publication because he was interested in Ovid and Ovid's poem of Metamorphosis in particular, which is a book all about bodily change. And so the Wellcome thought it would be a good idea to get me and a couple of other people to come and just speak for sort of, I think it was 8 minutes each, about these designated themes. And I kind of assumed, because the audience would be largely there to hear Gavin and because they were interested in medicine and, body in society today, that the last thing they'd want to hear about was, an Augustan poet, especially one that wrote in Latin. But actually they were completely fascinated. And it was sort of that process, in a sense, that led both me and I think the Wellcome simultaneously to think, a book on Greek and Roman bodies written by Carrie might be the thing to do. And it was just at that time that I was cycling home from my Zumba class on a Saturday through Cambridge, and a guy on a rented mobility scooter shot out from the side of the road, not looking where he was going, and I braked and went straight over the top of my bicycle and landed on my head in the road, and sort of had to stay there for rather too long a time as the ambulance came. And in the end only broke my arm, but that sort of made me think about my own body in a different kind of way. And these two things sort of, coincided to make me think now's a good time to think about, what it was to be a human, breathing, bleeding thing back in antiquity. I'm an art historian and I think about statues all the time, but what happens if you try and think beyond them?
I have a lot of very particular questions to ask you about the Greek and Roman body, specifically because I'm not somebody that is very well versed in sort of the social and cultural aspect of the ancient world, that I came into the subject, God knows why. The older I get, I'm like, what was it about this that really fascinated me? Military movements. I loved seeing armies move. I loved seeing how they attacked, what happened in battles, not looking at the social aspect at all, which is very weird. It's probably because I used to play like Rome Total War when I was a kid on my computer. So that's, I think, where it came from. But also then, as I then sort of progressed in my studies, it was philosophy. So this was really very much out of my depth, where I was like,
those two bits are the bits of classics that I'm, absolutely on. But never mind. We complement each other perfectly.
exactly. So I have lots of very odd questions, which I'm sure you're going to be like, Erica, what does this even mean, and where did this come from? And it's quite funny because normally I don't have such particular questions. Normally I'm like, can you explain this briefly? And here I'm like, okay, we've got the page numbers and the quotes. So the first one that I have, we're going to start nice and very broad, is on page 40. You wrote about this discussion of how people believed that women were born from the unlucky side of the womb in the ancient world, and that was the left side of the womb. And then you go on to discuss, more so about women and bodies and all of this, and sort of mothers, which I do want to get into after this. But that in particular was so interesting to me. This one throwaway line of this idea of the unlucky side of the womb having been the left side, and women were obviously formed there. So can you explain to me, and also then the audience who are watching this, what was it about the left side that was unlucky? Is that known as being unlucky, like left-handed, all of this in the ancient world? And also, who is it that came up with this odd theory?
Yeah, that I don't. Off the top of my head, I don't know. I'm afraid, but yes, the left side of the body is or was thought of as being less lucky than the right. And of course, women were deemed to be the antithesis of men in all regards. In a sense, they were deemed to be aberrant men. If they'd lucked out, they would have been born male. And because of that, they're always being constructed as antitypes. They're colder, they're wetter, they're lefter, they're so in a sense, it's that I was interested in, really, in thinking about why it was that in a world in which, when you read Ovid's Metamorphoses, there's actually quite a lot of exploration of gender fluidity and ambiguity, and, as we said before, bodily change, why it is that they still construct masculinity and femininity as these binaries.
It literally just took me for like such a loop when I read that, and as well to have it followed by a little bit later on in the discussion of your book, and again sort of moving into motherhood and having rights over female bodies, I think is the way I'm going to choose to phrase that, is the discussion of contraception and also abortion. The funnest fact that I have told people after reading your book, and let me tell you, I figured out a way to throw it into every single conversation, is the first ban of abortion comes in 211 CE under Caracalla. And that to me was really interesting because the discussion of abortion in the ancient world was so different, that it was about, today we have this discussion of whether the fetus is a person, whether it's living, does it have a soul? That's the discussion. Whereas in the ancient world, it was, oh, well, you're taking this right away from men to have legitimate children, and we can't allow that. So we're going to have to put a ban on this because women can't choose those things. I was wondering if you could talk us a little bit through that, because I could have read a whole book on this one paragraph that you wrote in your book.
I mean, that's not my primary research. There has been a lot of research on this topic, but it is one of those things I chose to highlight for precisely the reasons that you've hit upon, that, in all sorts of ways, it seems surprising to discover that abortion is there as a live debate. And the sort of temptation is then to kind of assume that it maps very neatly onto the parameters of the debate today. But of course, the next step is to realize that it doesn't, for all of the reasons that you've just outlined. And, it's part and parcel, really, of the debate in antiquity about what constitutes, when an embryo becomes something more than an embryo, when a child becomes a person, and when personhood begins. And it is about control of the female body, and it's about anxieties in a world that can't do DNA tests, that so it's all part and parcel of that, really. And it really only starts to map onto the parameters that you're talking about as being live today when you get to late antiquity and into what becomes the dominant religion, Christianity. So I'm interested in sort of finding those little points which sort of make it seem as though the ancients are kind of like us, and that maybe they're thinking in similar terms, only then to expose the ways in which actually that doesn't quite map.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's one of the biggest appeals of the ancient world as well, that there are some things that seem very relatable, and yet then the more you get into it, the more you're like, yeah, on the surface, kind of similar, but it's so unbelievably different that you have to step back and look at it through a different lens. And I find that modern authors like yourself are doing such a great job of communicating that as well through nonfiction writing. And I think one of the ways that you also do it in your book is by putting in lots of little anecdotes as well, to be like, oh, this is something that I experienced that is similar, but now we're going to show you as well how it's very different. More specifically, you have a discussion on page 70 about how you went to a GP. This GP gave you medicine, and then your friend was like, oh, don't take the medicine, come to yoga with me. And you went to yoga, and it helped you understand sort of Plato and his thought process of like the soul and the body being very different. So as an ancient historian, do you find that a lot of times you're looking at ancient sources and relating it to the modern world, sort of, so looking at that isolated and pulling it forward? Or do you find that you are looking at things in your life and relating it back to things that you've read or seen? Sort of which direction is that coming from?
I think both of those things. I think that when I wrote this, I wanted to write a book that in some senses wore my personality as narrator quite lightly. And actually one of the things my editor said to me was you're very sort of modest about plonking yourself into the text, but at the same time I was determined to put myself in there sometimes as a prompt, really, to get the reader to put themselves into the text and to think about their relationship with their body vis-a-vis what they were reading in antiquity. And in a way, I suppose part of what I'm trying to do is change the way that we write about the past. It's why I started each chapter in the way that I did, with a god and a bit of mythology, to try and kind of cut across those divides between, say, a historian's work and the fictionalizing work of someone like Madeline Miller, and try and kind of have the two bleed together. Inevitably, when I'm thinking about antiquity and talking about antiquity, no matter what style I wrote that in, inevitably my life experience impacts on how I interpret the source material in front of me. So I suppose the more conscious I can be about that process, the more helpful I hope the exegesis of the evidence is really to my reader. So it was a sort of constant interplay for me between similarity and difference.
And has writing this book changed how you've then taught moving forward? Has it changed that voice of being a professor, or would you say that it just sort of very much complemented how you also teach your students in the classroom and sort of communicate to the people sitting in front of you?
I don't think it's particularly changed the way that I teach. I mean, I'm a classicist that does huge amounts of access and outreach stuff. I'm always speaking in schools. I edit Omnibus, which is a magazine for schools and sixth formers and their teachers. Communication and public communication of my subject is really important to me. And I think there's nothing so complicated that you can't talk about it to 12-year-olds if you do it in the right kind of way. Having said that, most of what I teach, as a sort of accident again, really, is history of art. So it's, I teach vast amounts of ancient sculpture and painting. And I have taught a course on prostitutes and saints. I co-taught it with a colleague of mine, Simon Goldhill, several years ago. And that inevitably informed certainly the late antique chapter of this book. But No, I mean, I suppose I think about this book and the way I teach in a kind of as a continuum, really. Um, Although I was trying to go for something pretty lyrical here that you would pick up and want to read from cover to cover in a way that you don't with most academic books.
Well, I certainly found that. Absolutely, because again, this is not my area at all. And actually, I was recommended the book by a friend of mine who's called Cozy, and she had read it and she knew this was totally out of my realm of anything. And she's very much into discussing bodies and sexuality in the ancient world. So she was like, go and get this book. It's very accessible, I promise. And one thing I thought that your writing did such a good job of, which is why I asked that question, is explaining the topic so simply and taking us on this journey, but not compromising any academic language. Like, I felt like we were still really thrown into, you know, you're going to learn some terms, we're going to go really into this, but done in a very, like, don't worry, comforting, teacher kind of way, which is why I then immediately emailed you and was like, I love this book.
Yeah, I mean, one of the students that I teach, because I have another job in the Netherlands at the moment for 5 years, and one of the students that I teach there, graduate student, said to me that the chapter on sexuality in women, she said it was the first time that she felt that ancient women were being talked about as human beings with feelings and bodies, and that their experiences were being kind of brought to the fore. And that is probably the nicest thing anyone's ever said about the book. But I think a large part of that is about letting my subjectivity and the reader's subjectivity kind of, run, really, rather than trying to stifle that, whilst at the same time always using both the literary culture and the visual culture as a way of then bringing the questions and then hopefully the answers to the surface, rather than kind of imposing anything from above.
And something as well in the book for everybody at home, in case you guys like pictures, there were lots of pictures in this book, which is wonderful. There's always a good place to sort of bounce back to of what you're talking about. And one thing that completely fascinated me was, and you had drawings of this as well, was how the ancients would try to like decipher somebody's character based on what they looked like. And so this comes with like animals and it comes with like eye color and all of this like crazy stuff. So I was wondering if that's something that you learnt as you were writing the book, like how much of this wacky stuff that was included, fascinating stuff, but wacky, that was included in the book was learnt along the journey of writing the book, and how much of it was sort of harbored in your brain that you were thinking, how do I get this down on a page? Oh, I figured it out.
I think a bit of both. So I think I could only have written this book if I'd been teaching and researching for a long time by now, because it covers, from 700 BC to 600 CE, in a thematic way, and that's not something that you can do overnight. The use of pictures is obviously something I always do because I think visually. I always have done ever since being on site with my dad, I think. And I find the visual one of the easiest ways to teach ancient mentalities, really, because you can actually show and tell as you do so. The bit that you're honing in on is the bit about the ways in which certain people in antiquity, in particular from the 4th century BCE on, and it became really popular under the Roman Empire in the 2nd century CE, how certain people thought that you could tell what somebody's character was like by actually the way that they looked and the way that they moved. So a sort of sense that people wore their souls on their sleeves, really. And that by close scrutiny, you could actually kind of, study their character as part and parcel of a technique that they called physiognomy. And they did this by kind of thinking about sort of which animal you most resembled, and by also then thinking in really kind of quite grossly sort of ethnic stereotyping sorts of ways, but to try and kind of increasingly pinpoint whether you were somebody to be trusted or somebody not to be trusted, etc. And by the time you get to the 18th century and on, This is picked up by modern scholarship, and that's where the drawings that you're talking about come from. Are those, these are not ancient drawings, but they're drawings that would be impossible without that ancient literary material.
I think it's like that's something that when I was reading it, I thought, oh, that's also an argument that's kind of an idea, even that is transcended through time as well. Like people still try and do these things. Like I even think when I was younger, it's going to sound very silly, but like I used to look at people's coffee orders. I'm from an Italian family, so coffee was very important in my household. And I would judge people on like, oh, well, they're clearly this type of person if they're ordering a vanilla latte, like the most ridiculous things. But this idea of prediction is something that is still so inherent to humans.
And the popular press do it all the time. All of this sort of, the length of your index finger tells you, how good you are in bed or whatever. I mean that sort of stuff. And it is no less dangerous now, actually, from what it was in antiquity. And that's, you were asking whether that's something I knew or I learned about en route. And I mean, you have seeds of this knowledge, but the more philosophical the material got, the more I had to kind of do research on that. Unlike you, I'd never studied ancient philosophy. I was a historian, an art historian, and literary scholar through and through. And it was the scariest thing I had to do, giving the 2 early chapters that do deal with some philosophical material to David Sedley, the Emeritus Lawrence Chair of Ancient Philosophy, and basically saying, could you mark this, please? That feeling never goes away. And trying to do that in a way that was, not too technical, but not doing any sort of injustice to the material is quite hard. And one of the ways I did it with that was to do it, as I say, through the lens of the reception of that material in the 18th century and early 19th.
On to some more technical questions, if you don't mind. And on page 105 of your book, you wrote one quote, which, again, this is not even a sentence, and I underlined it and just went, what? Which is, prostitutes with hobnailed sandals designed to leave provocative messages in the dust. Now, I was wondering if you remembered this kind of research that you were talking about in the book, and also what it means.
So, I mean, it is extremely tentative, this, and it's probably one of the things in the book that has the least evidence behind it. But there is a tiny bit of evidence that evidence, but material extant that suggests that prostitutes wore sandals that somehow kind of left messages or marks in the dust that are sort of signs of the trade almost. But I mean, this was me dealing with a kind of cliche that's come down to us about antiquity. It's not me wanting to, I would never teach that because there's no evidence for that. In the same way that I wouldn't teach that prostitutes in Rome wore togas. There's a tiny bit of again, evidence to suggest that they did that, but that's part of a discourse that is all about, once you are a woman who sells her body, then in a sense you have sold your femininity also. And by virtue of that, you are potentially constructed as wearing no longer your dress of maidenhood and womanhood, but rather a dress that would normally be the kind of dress that you would wear as a citizen man. So that's not the same thing as saying, prostitutes in Rome walked around in togas.
How much of this stuff, when you were researching, was difficult in that way, that you're presented with something that was really interesting in maybe a more modern source? I just mean not an ancient source, by more modern source. Things that you had found that then weren't really found in the ancient world, but was still really interesting and you wanted to not highlight, but just sort of throw in there and discuss.
I mean, at the end of the day, even when you're talking about something as physical as a flesh and blood body, a lot of what you are dealing with are ancient attitudes to the body. You can't actually get that close to what an ancient flesh and blood body was, looked like, felt like. And that's, that is a major problem. And so you're constantly dealing with perception, And when you read a lot of the secondary literature, a lot of this academic literature, you'll get these little sort of nuggets that you think, wow, that sounds absolutely brilliant. And you'll chase down the source and realize actually the source doesn't say that at all. And so you've got to be terribly careful. And that's why, I wanted to, this book's got a huge amount of apparatus at the end so that, everything I read is cross-referenced and always back to the ancient source so that people can have a chance of going and looking at it for themselves. But it's like you mentioned contraception before, and there's some texts, ancient texts, that talk about contraception, but there's a big gap, just as there is today, between theory and practice. And I have no idea whether any of these contraceptive methods were ever used. Your guess is as good as mine. And you might think that by the time you get to the Roman Empire, elites are desperately trying to have children. Desperately trying to stop themselves having children. But actually, it seems fairly clear that actually that wasn't a problem really, and that so who knows how much these things are actually kind of being used, or what people thought about on the ground. And it's like how far does the sort of medical advice that you get in Hippocratic treatises, how does that, that's much more interested in mapping symptoms than it is, thinking about making people well. So there are big gaps there too.
A question I was just thinking of, I actually asked Professor Tim Whitmarsh this question as well, because he wrote about atheism in the ancient world, which blew my brain. I was like, this is amazing and fantastic, and I want to talk about all of this. But something that he had to do, something that he was saying as well, was because it's for wider reading, the outreach is to reach as many people as possible with this book. So you have to make it palatable for not necessarily just academics, which means you've got to write more definitive sentences, where he was saying, when you write academic papers, you can say, well, we don't know, and this is just inferred, and you can think this, that, and the other, because you're writing for that audience who already knows that. So with your book as well, did you find that a struggle to adjust? You don't make, and I have to say, you don't make these hard definitive sentences throughout your book. That's not something that's really there. But it is certainly more clear than possibly, these answers are and could have been. Was that an adjustment to make, or because you're so used to it, you're more used to sort of watering that discussion down?
I didn't find that a problem particularly. I think that that quite a lot of the book is written in a very suggestive way. And I have no problem with saying probably or perhaps when I'm on more tentative ground. I think one of the main problems for me in a book like this is because, as I was saying, ancient attitudes are what's so important. You want to try and channel those, and you want to focalize them as an author. Often they're not very nice, those attitudes. We've talked already a bit about the attitudes towards women in antiquity. And so the problem comes in trying to keep the text snappy and keep it pacey and keep it moving, that sometimes my editor would say to me, hang on a minute, Carrie, I know you, and I know that what you're putting here is you're channeling an ancient attitude towards something. But if you're not careful, your reader might think that you think that. Right. And so it's about so there were these moments when, it was as though I was coming across all misogynist or racist or whatever, when actually what I was doing was I was trying to summarize for my reader an attitude in, for example, the poet Juvenal, without necessarily getting too bogged down in the specifics of the Latin, or even necessarily the specifics of the place of this particular piece of literature within a broader corpus. And so that's where you've got to be quite careful, and where occasionally I had to put the odd bit of slack in to make sure that was clear, and that would slow the text down a little bit. And that's always the balance, trying to keep it moving, but at the same time make sure that you don't mislead, or, as I say, come across in ways that you never meant to come across.
Well, I had a question about as well, channeling, as you were saying, channeling these ancient authors, these ancient attitudes. You spoke, if I can find the page, You spoke about, yes, chapter 6, page 211. You spoke about an Athenian woman called, I'm going to butcher this, Agnodike, I think is her name. But she ended up being a medical student. She had to dress up as a man, pretend to be a man, to be a medical student because that was not allowed. And something that I was thinking when I was reading this section, and I could be completely wrong. There's lots of these in my interviews where I'm like, I was inferring, and then professors are going, Erica, come back. That has nothing to do with this. But so she had to, pretend to be a man, ends up becoming a doctor. But that wasn't allowed, and she's the person, I think, you can correct me, that actually alleviated that ban on women doctors in this patriarchal society. Am I right?
Well, I mean, that's the story.
Right, okay, so yes. So this is the story that she was this great person, all of this. Now, when I was reading that, I was wondering, obviously this is a patriarchal society, so we do have to think about it differently because women had like this much in the whole society. But I was thinking from a mythological point of view, would mythologies and would stories for the ancient Greeks during this period have also, obviously they're also written by men, we're going to talk in circles with this, but would they have sort of inferred those laws as well? Because when I was thinking of women who dealt with herbs, because they weren't doctors in mythology, you've got Medea and Circe, who are very dangerous women. So you don't want women really playing with herbs and trying to, cast spells because they're going to be evil. But when I thought about people who were doctors in mythology, we think of Machaon from the Iliad, who was loved and adored and this great hero. Would that have impacted those rules in that society and impacted that attitude? Because we had all of these stories as well of like, well, look what happens if women do get this.
Yeah, I mean, inevitably mythology is a way of making sense of the world. So you write the myths that you need to make society the way that you want it. But I mean, there's archaeological evidence. I mean, there's a lovely grave stele in the book to a female doctor, and it mentions her father, so it's likely that she was probably trained in the family business. But you're right that obviously, if you're thinking about the ways in which society constructs these things, then women messing around, as you said, with herbs is part and parcel of a kind of, I mean, it's a bit like in ancient imperial historical texts like Tacitus and Suetonius, that poison tends to be a very feminine way of killing people, and it goes along with the sort of seclusion and interiority and privateness of being a woman, which of course, it's male society that demands that seclusion, but at the same time, that means that your women are potentially up to no good in the, so there's all of that is very gendered, I think. But the relationship between the mythology and everyday practice is not straightforward, I think.
Did you find yourself getting bogged down in lots of these loops? Because when I was reading, it's sort of, I just said, we're going to end up talking in circles, as you then ended up demonstrating. And I just think that, not that I could ever write a nonfiction book because I'm just a YouTuber, but like if I were to ever sit down and start to think about something like this and be like, I'm going to write this great project, I would find myself in loops and then just kind of give up because I'd be like, well, there's no way of knowing.
Yeah, I mean, if what you want to do is write a book that winds up knowing, then you are going to fail. And that was never my intention. And you'll notice that the book isn't organized chronologically because it also didn't want to give any sense of a kind of evolving story, as though, in the 700s, you start off primitive and then attitudes to the body change sort of progressively and in ways that we can map very clearly over time until you get to Christianity when ... Now, as I hope the book shows, actually, if you were to ask me what were attitudes to the afterlife like in 2nd century CE Rome? Well, it depends who you ask. And even if you ask, how are they treating the body? Well, again, it depends where you look. And so I think as long as you understand that the project is about trying to bring some sort of spotlight to the bits of evidence that we do have, to tell some plausible stories with those bits of evidence so as to show by example, then I think you're okay. I think you can do that. It's just that, and you've got to be very careful and make sure that, you make it very clear when the examples you're using are very typical and when they're absolutely esoteric. But I think as long as you do that, then it's okay. But if you set out wanting to show how it was, then you are inevitably going to fail.
So as my final question for today's interview, I like to end these chats in the same way that I start all of the chats, with the same questions for everybody. And considering a lot of my audience would not have access to you without these videos and without this interview, specifically about this book, I was wondering if you could give them a piece of advice when it comes to art history, when it comes to the ancient world from an artistic point of view. What is the advice that you would give to them in approaching this side, this aspect of the ancient world? What is it that could help them? What piece of advice could you give them so they can continue learning and reading, on this journey?
I think if it's history of art that you want to do, or classics with a very visual component, then the most important thing by an absolute mile is to go to galleries and exhibitions, not only of Greco-Roman material, but of any material, and to go with someone else. Because then in discussion, in actually kind of talking with your friend about particular pieces that you're drawn to, and to let yourself be drawn to particular pieces, not to kind of go around slavishly sort of reading each label, but to kind of walk into a room and have the nerve to just kind of walk over to one thing and respond to it. Because actually it's in doing that and articulating what it is that you see that you are beginning to argue with the visual, and you're also building data sets. And art history is all about, it's compare and contrast, and you can't do that without seeing lots of this stuff in its original form. And so that would be my advice, and it's pleasurable, and no matter what stage you are in your career, you need to keep doing that, and as I say, not just ancient but of all periods.
So with all that being said, this seems like the perfect place to wrap up this interview. So thank you so much, Professor VOUT, for sitting and chatting with me. But obviously, as well, thank you guys at home for watching these interviews, for engaging with the channel. I hugely, hugely appreciate it, because the more you guys engage, the more you guys like, the more you guys subscribe, the more I can bring on experts like Professor VOUT to chat with you guys, to chat with me, and to discuss topics that I am not very well versed in, to open up these topics for you guys. Now, throughout this chat, if you guys were convinced to buy Exposed, the Ancient Greek and Roman Body, obviously all of the links to the book are in the description below, so you guys can find those down there. The Goodreads, the Amazon, everything you need. Professor VOUT is not really on social media, so I won't be linking any of those, but I will instead be linking some chats that I listen to on YouTube by Professor VOUT, which I think are really, really good. So you guys can also find those down there. But thank you guys so much, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on the channel. So I'll see you guys then.